his regime's actions sparked the formation and growth of leftist paramilitary groups to oppose him. And that often happens. In Nicaragua between 1978 and 1979, the left-wing Sandinistas overthrew the entrenched Somoza regime after years of bloody civil war that saw 50,000 Nicaraguans killed and countless others tortured, raped, or otherwise injured by partisans on both sides. Under the Somoza family's dictatorial rule, which had lasted almost half a century and was enforced by its National Guard, the U.S. had enjoyed more or less friendly relations with the regime, though it was always a game of balance. If the U.S. gives the appearance of supporting Luis Somoza, it will be taken as a sign that we are continuing to deny opposition aspirations, explained one State Department official. This is in 1956. This could well cause a deterioration in the feeling toward us in many groups, both in Nicaragua and elsewhere. It would be a convenient basis for communist propaganda. Then he added, on the other hand, if we do not give the appearance of wholehearted support to Luis, we might lose in some circles. The general impression in Nicaragua throughout the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s was that the U.S. was a supporter of the Somoza dictatorship, if not an enthusiastic cheerleader. Well, that all changed in 1979 when a political and military organization called the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or the FSLN, named for Cesar Augusto Sandino. This is a Nicaraguan freedom fighter who'd resisted the 1927 to 1933 U.S. occupation and eluded U.S. capture by retreating with a few hundred of his guerrilla fighters into the jungly mountains of Nicaragua. So it's named after him. Anyway, the FSLN overthrew the Somoza family in 1979, confiscated all their property, which was significant, and began nationalizing major industries. Many of the Sandinistas, under the leadership of a Marxist-Leninist named Daniel Ortega, were committed socialists, carefully cultivating strong support among the peasantry, among the workers, among the students here in Nicaragua. Having toppled the Somoza government, the FSLN now set about establishing its own power throughout the country by organizing national workers groups, national student groups, by organizing local and regional level governing committees, by building up a sizable Sandinista popular army under the leadership of Daniel Ortega's brother, Humberto, and by organizing a secret police to clamp down on internal dissent. The Sandinista regime also nationalized, as I mentioned, Nicaragua's major industries. The small businesses, small farmers, these were allowed to function. These were tolerated by the new regime. But the big guys nationalized. See, the FSLN, whose popularity was based in large part on a promise to hold free and fair elections, the first free and fair elections in Nicaragua of the 20th century, also tolerated opposition parties. They sort of had to. In other words, parties opposed to the FSLN, though that toleration had its limits. In the meantime, however, the regime launched a nationwide and apparently very successful literacy campaign. But in all of this, the Sandinistas were not unopposed. Some of the group's top leaders, not all of whom were Marxist by any means, actually resigned in opposition to what they saw as Ortega's trouncing of political rights. Not to mention the regime's increasing dependence on both Cuba and on the Soviet Union. And some of the leadership didn't like that either. The Sandinistas' chief enemy, however, were Honduras-based paramilitaries. The Sandinistas denounced them as counter-revolutionaries, known as the Contras. Some of these guys are former Sandinista soldiers who had become disaffected with the direction of the new regime. Some were former Nicaraguan military. Some were Nicaraguan farmers or peasants who resented the Sandinista intrusion into their lives. Some were Nicaraguan Catholics or Nicaraguan Protestants who resented Sandinista hostility toward religion. Some were Mosquito Indians or members of other indigenous groups who felt targeted by the Sandinistas, the the nationalist, socialist Sandinistas, who of course had a centralizing, nationalizing agenda. The main Contra faction, it was called the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, the FDN, was led by a former officer of the Nicaraguan military. His name was Enrique Bermudez, and the former president of the Chamber of Construction, his name was Jose Francisco Cardenal. And this is where the US steps in. See, within a year or thereabouts of the Sandinista takeover of Nicaragua, CIA-trained Cuban exiles are training Nicaraguan exiles in camps in Florida. They're being trained in paramilitary tactics. Remember that about 20 years earlier, the staging area for the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba had been Nicaragua. In addition, President Carter had approved multiple covert CIA operations in and around Nicaragua in support of groups opposed to the Sandinistas. Farmers groups, religious groups, pro-US parties, unions. The Contras were also supported by the government of Argentina, by the way, who helped supply the FDN, and the government of Honduras, who also helped supply the Contras, often in the form of material provided by the United States and then handed over by Honduras. And of course, Honduras also allowed the Contras to use its jurisdiction as a staging ground for attacks into Nicaragua. Under Jimmy Carter then, there's training happening, and there are CIA resources flowing to anti-Sandinista elements in and around Nicaragua. But as we'll see, this was just the beginning. In El Salvador, in the year 1979, the increasingly unstable rule of repressive President Carlos Humberto Romero, this guy's the last in a line of military dictators going back to 1931, threatened to turn the country into another Nicaragua. Of course, next door in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas have taken over. As a general, Romero had targeted left-wing groups in El Salvador, even massacring scores of alleged Marxist-indoctrinated students here in Santa Ana, as well as in San Salvador. As president, his police and military continued to carry out a campaign of repression, often marked by the killing of the government's perceived enemies. His regime's actions sparked the formation and growth of leftist paramilitary groups to oppose him, and that often happens. When protests against his regime threatened to metastasize into revolution, again, similar to what was happening next door in Nicaragua at the same time, Romero ordered his military and police forces to crack down hard against the demonstrators. Despite the El Salvadoran government's dictatorial ways, it had been deemed by Washington, D.C. to be reliably anti-communist, and thus, in a Cold War context, Romero and his predecessors had enjoyed U.S. diplomatic support. El Salvador's armed forces had even been trained by the CIA. But in October 1979, Romero, deemed by some in the military as too weak and too rigidly anti-reform to prevent a Sandinista-style overthrow here in El Salvador, was unseated in a bloodless military coup and forced into exile. The coup's leaders also purged around 20% of the Salvadoran military. So now you've got a joint military-civilian government, a junta, being establishing a new dictatorship over El Salvador. Now, to U.S. diplomats and to President Jimmy Carter and his advisors, it seemed that the new regime might actually offer the best hope for stability in El Salvador. Stability that could prevent the country from turning red. Of course, that's the Cold War concern here. I should mention, by the way, there's no evidence that I'm aware of that the U.S. played a role in the coup that removed Romero. In any case, hopeful that El Salvador might be turning a new leaf, the U.S. began to support the new military dictatorship. And it was helped by the fact that the regime, at least in the beginning, trumpeted its alleged differences with the old regimes. We will correct past wrongs. You know, the junta's leaders were promising these types of things. We will release all the political prisoners. We will carry out sorely needed political reforms. We'll carry out sorely needed social reforms and economic reforms. We invite back political exiles. Come home and help us build a new El Salvador. But the militant left would have none of it, and fighting continued. In the course of this unfolding civil war, that's really what it was, both sides, but especially the regimes, carried out real atrocities. And this is a conundrum, of course, for Jimmy Carter, who for years now has presented himself as a champion of human rights, and for years now has pledged specifically to stop the tradition of American interventionism in Central America, in South America, and the Caribbean. So how can he keep such promises? How can he maintain such positions? How can that be squared with U.S. support for yet another human rights squelching Central American dictatorship? On the other hand, was Carter really expected to allow El Salvador to be overrun by Soviet-leaning forces, as was happening at that very moment in nearby Nicaragua? At the very least, reasoned Carter, the new regime, however brutal, seemed a little better than the old one. It seemed like at least it might be a step or a half step in the right direction. Well, in return for their support, of course, the Americans demanded that the new regime exclude leftist elements from the coalescing junta entirely. Unfortunately, in its quest to consolidate power and now flush with U.S. military aid, including war material and riot gear, by the way, and, of course, in the name of anti-communism, the new regime began killing suspected leftists, including multiple Catholic priests critical of the government. Indeed, just 1 month after the Archbishop of San Salvador, his name was Oscar Romero. He was a committed believer in the power of the Catholic faith to defend human rights. And he felt that that was part of his calling and ministry. And he'd written a letter to President Carter pleading with him to stop providing military aid to the El Salvadoran government. Okay, so a month after he writes this letter, the Archbishop was assassinated during Mass. This is an operation, by the way, carried out by an El Salvadoran military officer with U.S. training. Okay? That was in March 1980. Fast forward 9 months, now you're in December. 4 American women in El Salvador. 3 of them are nuns and one's a missionary. They were all helping resettle refugees displaced by the conflict. These 4 were abducted, they were raped, and they were killed by Salvadoran National Guardsmen. So after that, Carter finally ordered a pause to the aid to the Salvadoran government. But his advisors eventually convinced him that the move had to be reversed. An urgent decision is needed regarding arms and ammunition for El Salvador, insisted National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski on January 14, 1981. This is in a letter to President Carter, and here I'll quote from the letter at length. Okay, here we go. The situation in El Salvador has become militarily more critical. In the last several days, the government has lost significant amounts of ammunition. An arsenal in Santa Ana has been blown up, and our mill group believes that the government may have as little as 1 week's supply left. Added Brzezinski, at stake is essentially the very concept of your policy for Central America. Okay, so he's telling Carter that his own policy, his reputation, his legacy is at stake here. So, and then Brzezinski continues, that we resolve long overdue inequities, Panama Canal treaties, land reform, democratization, but without handing the region over to Castro. I see the provision of lethal military assistance as an integral part of our efforts. Not to do so now, and to let Reagan do it next week, will simply play into the hands of our critics, in addition perhaps to permitting, in the meantime, a very adverse outcome on the ground. Recommendation, this is what he says for his recommendation. Recommendation that you approve the interagency recommendation that the lethal material list is attached be provided, end quote. A few days before he left office, he'd just been defeated by Ronald Reagan in a landslide, Carter ordered the resumption of aid. By aid, of course, I mean weapons, guns, ammo, even combat helicopters, all in the name of combating Marxist terrorism. Well, when Reagan moved into the White House, of course, he had been critical of Carter's softness, as he saw it, towards communism. So anti-communist intervention in Latin America under Reagan increases. By now, the insurgency against the Salvadoran regime had devolved into a full-fledged guerrilla war, with anti-government forces aided by the Sandinistas and supplied in part by a network of communist parties and states coordinated out of Havana. It seemed military aid from Cuba was making its way to El Salvador via secret shipments and secret air transports to Nicaragua, where it would then make its way over land here to El Salvador. Guerrillas took over radio stations. Guerrillas burned buses. They extorted travelers. They carried out extensive and numerous hit-and-run operations. In response, the U.S. military granted the regime even more military aid year by year. Unfortunately, it seemed the regime's brutality also increased year by year. On multiple occasions, that brutality boiling over to actual mass murder. In addition, the U.S. also continued to provide training to the Salvadoran military, both at the U.S. Army School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, and from bases next door in Honduras. U.S. support for the Salvadoran regime continued into the presidency of José Napoleón Duarte. This is between 1984 and 1989. Now, Duarte's rule, actively supported by the CIA. In fact, Reagan and then George H.W. Bush after him saw Duarte as the Central American counterweight to Ortega, maybe the Central American counterweight to Castro. So they looked to him to be their great anti-communist champion here, and they looked the other way when the Salvadoran military and Salvadoran death squads carry out killings and other atrocities in the name of purging the country of enemies of the state. By the time the Salvadoran Civil War was over, this is in 1992, between 70,000 and 80,000 civilians have been killed. The majority of them, by the way, at the hands of government forces. Many of those forces recipients of U.S. training, many of them armed with U.S. weaponry or otherwise funded by the U.S. taxpayer.